Hello and a warm welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Chunya podcast. Well, good to have you back on the show today. I hope you're doing well and I hope you're really looking forward to the year-end holiday and looking forward to the year 2022 in great anticipation. Well, personally, I am looking forward to year 2022 as well. And most importantly, in relevance to the podcast, I have a great lineup of speakers, topics, and the discussions will continue and all the topics related to the global net zero transition, climate change, sustainability will go on and on and on. I'm sure you're really enjoying the podcast, the blog, and all the posts on the social media. So thank you for staying through the year with me. And if you have been a regular listener, I hope you have taken some time to rate the podcast on platforms like iTunes, Spotify, and so on. And you can also drop me a feedback. Well, year ends are usually good for reflections and feedback. So you can write a review or you can give me a feedback directly on the email. missionchunya@gmail.com is the ID. So considering this is a year-end episode, year-end release, I don't want to give you a long-form conversation or topic that is more intense. Or rather, I am again taking a time off and I'm going to reflect on a book that I read in this year. And it was one of the most popular books of the year and it comes from Bill Gates. The book is How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. I'm sure you would have heard about the book or you would have seen some blog post or reviews about the book in social media. So I did read the book, and as usual when I read books, especially the non-fiction ones, I do make some notes. And considering this topic is very relevant to what I work on, I thought the book had some great trivia, interesting insights and interesting perspectives from Bill Gates. Well, we all know about Bill Gates for sure, so I'm not going to talk about the author in detail, but I'm going to leave a few insights that I picked up from the book on this episode. Well, the other reason that I wanted to do a solo episode again was because of all the positive feedback that I received in recent weeks, considering I did a few solo episodes on COP26, career in clean tech, and so on. So a lot of people really liked me going solo and talking about topics. So even I'm excited to talk about today's topic. So let's get started with it. The first part is obviously the beginning, and Bill Gates begins the book with three narratives which are quite clear. One is that we need to get to net zero. Two is we have to deploy technologies that we have today like wind, solar and other clean technologies because we have to deploy them faster and enable the transition to net zero. And the third part is we need better technologies. We of course can't get to net zero and sustain that for a long term unless we have new technologies like carbon capture and a lot more coming up in the next decade. So the three things are very clear and he sets the book straight away saying we need to understand that these three are important and let's see why these are important. So in the early stages of the book, Bill Gates also gives readers, especially readers who are new to this field, a little bit of perspective, little bit of understanding. Like for example, saying why is everything around carbon dioxide equivalents, that because we generally understand why it is, but he makes effort in kind of making any normal reader understand everything in detail. Like for example, CO2 stays longer in the atmosphere and hence everything is represented in terms of CO2 equivalent. So then Bill Gates gets on to the big topic. The big thing is about 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And the entire narrative of the book, the major part of the book is around why it is 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year and what are the sectors that are contributing to it and how can we individually look at decarbonizing this. So 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year is the emissions, net emissions from all the sectors put together. So this is where I feel the entire narrative kind of is very simple. For example, we in general, if we didn't pay much attention to the ecosystem, we would assume that generating energy kind of is a major contributor, or rather, for example, driving transportation is a major contributor to this 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. But no, we are kind of off if we assume that, because making products, like for example, making products like cement, steel is a major contributor, nearly 1/3. To be exact, it's about 30 to 31% of the global annual contributions comes from making products. So whatever emissions are associated with manufacturing is accounted under this 31%. So producing electricity is the second biggest contributor. About 27% of global annual emissions comes from generating energy. And decarbonizing, as Bill Gates mentioned early on in the book, is very important, especially getting solar and wind projects at a faster rate in the next decade is very essential if we are really serious about the net zero transition. And important insights like how solar and wind power projects have developed and improved in the last decade or so have been clearly highlighted in this section. For example, people who are new to this will clearly understand that solar projects have come down in cost. They have come down by a factor of 8 to 10 times in the last decade or so. So this is an interesting chapter where he mentions about generating energy and what are the alternatives to kind of get us to net zero or decarbonize in a rapid scale. So the next big sector is producing food, growing food. That accounts for about 19% of the global annual emissions. By means of growing food, it involves both agriculture, dairy, cattle, and everything. So that accounts for about 19% of the global annual emissions. And interestingly, transportation comes fourth, accounting for about 16% of the net emissions annually. And finally, keeping us warm and cool accounts for about 7% of the global annual emissions. So when Bill Gates mentions about all this and he tallies up to 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, he brings about a good narrative about green premiums. So green premiums are the cost differential between the current solution that we have that emits CO2 and its alternative that doesn't. So in every chapter, he kind of goes in depth and understands the current technologies that are available to decarbonize the sector and puts an estimate in terms of price that is involved in kind of getting that alternative, and then makes a forecast, like saying if we put in money for R&D, what is the expectation that we can have? Like for example, if we get all the electric vehicles on road and replace all the gasoline vehicles, so what is the net impact that it could have and what is the premium? So interestingly, when we talk about electric vehicles, the reason that there is more emphasis on this is because the green premiums are very less and it is declining year on year. The same goes with renewable energy, wind and solar projects. The green premiums are little less. On the contrary, new and emerging technologies like carbon capture and storage, which you would have heard in a few earlier episodes, we have spoken about it in detail. The green premiums or the price of the technology today is more, and that is the reason it takes longer to market and longer time to scale and reach a big market penetration. So when the narrative shifts towards green premiums for different sectors, currently it's about like, for example, 10 to 15% for green premiums for plastics. For steel, it's about 15 to 30%. And for cement, it's nearly 75 to 100%. So decarbonizing cement production cost almost double of the alternative that we have today. So this is an interesting point that he brings to the book and the narrative so that it gives us a clear picture of where we are headed. So this part about green premiums is also very important because Bill Gates, through his work, through Breakthrough Energy Ventures and other work that he does in personal capacity and through the Climate Action Coalition, he looks at new companies and new startups in terms of having this green premiums and what is their potential to decarbonize. For example, he mentions about a few startups where he has invested and he claims, why did I invest there? Because the potential to decarbonize is significant for this technology or the particular sector that they are targeting. So that is the reason I invested in these companies. And so that story is a personal touch and that really brings a different dimension to the book and the narrative. So while this narrative about 51 gigatons occupies a major part of the book, there is also mention about the other things that are important for climate action. Like for example, a chapter around why is adaptation important? Because it reduces the risk of climate change and it also helps us in general prepare and respond to emergencies that are happening around the world. And it is also very important for countries and governments to look at adaptation in a big way because we have to ensure that the global prosperity that we are seeing in the last few decades across the planet is sustained. We don't want to have something like climate change affect the prosperity of people, and we have to ensure that everyone has a good chance of survival and prosperity together. So he does mention about adaptation and talks about it in very detail, which is also very interesting. And for a person who is known for his prowess in the technology front, he does mention that policy is also as important, or rather, even more important in today's context when it comes to having innovations. So, innovations need not be only on the technology front, but also policy innovations have to come up, and it has to come up in a big way from government officials and all stakeholders involved. So, why does he lay an emphasis on that? Because only government support can bridge the R&D gap, and rightly so, he cites about the success that ARPA-E program in US has had on technology front, especially on sectors like solar, EV, and so on. So that is important, while at the same time, generating finance, climate finance can also be accomplished by having something like prices on carbon, clean energy standards, and clean fuel standards. So policy across all this dimension is as important as the innovation that's happening in the technology front. So for a book that aims to reach a wider audience, it was very important for Bill Gates to kind of mention about this topic, the topic of what can we as a common citizen do. So what can we do? So that is an interesting chapter towards the end, and it is very concise, very clear. Like for example, as a citizen, he does emphasize that we also should look at running for office and being actively involved in politics or any government organization, so that there is a better communication channel between what is happening on ground and what is ideally required. So that is also something that he encourages. Well, most of us will be a rather passive consumer. So even in that case, there are a lot of things that we can do according to Bill Gates. Like for example, while we procure electricity, we can opt for renewable electricity by paying a premium, so that the green premium that is in the market today for renewable energy can be offset by consumers like us when we opt to pay for a higher price for that. Or we can also buy something like an electric vehicle, or reduce emissions wherever we can, like having electric heat pumps rather than gas boilers and so on. And most importantly, he also mentioned something like plant-based burger meat alternatives. Again, this is some topic that is of interest to me, and I have done a couple of episodes in the podcast over the last couple of years. So do check the archives and the playlist. There are a couple of good companies that I have featured in this space. The last part is also about how we as an employer or an employee in an organization can have an impact. Like for example, even in a case where we don't have a universal price on carbon, we can have something like an internal carbon taxes is what he's suggesting. And we can also be actively involved in government policy making. Of course, this is definitely true because big corporations have a say when it comes to government regulations, government policies. So that is something we as an employee can also emphasize and get our message across to the boards, the employer, and then it'll probably snowball into a big movement and make sure the policy front is rightly addressed, or rather rightly represented. So while I mention about this book and I talk about this topic, I'll also have to talk about Sir David Mackay's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And of course, Bill Gates also mentions about Sir David Mackay in the book and makes reference to Sir David Mackay in terms of how he approached the problem about decarbonizing and the way he put numbers to the different sectors. It is clearly evident that while Bill Gates has written about this book, he also had a good influence from Sir David Mackay. I have mentioned about it a few times in the podcast, so I will leave the link to that book as well. It is freely available. Of course, Sir David Mackay is no more, but his work and his influence is clearly seen in the sector, and I'm sure it will stay there for a long, long time. Well, listening to this, if you thought, okay, this is a serious book and it needs some serious reading, well, I should tell you that there are important bits of trivia that you'll find it really interesting. And the essence of the book is the trivia that is put in place, I should say, at the right time. Like, for example, there is a lot of debate on why we should shift to plant-based meat. But Bill Gates puts a number to it and tells that, see, cattle eat more calories than they offer in return. So, is it worth the bet from a climate perspective? There are a lot of trivia like this that makes the book an interesting read right throughout. Even if you're reading something like adaptation, or even, for example, if you're reading about electric vehicles, there are trivia like this that will make you enjoy the book thoroughly. Like, for example, the difference between batteries and gasoline. Although there is an emphasis on batteries for electric vehicles, even in today's best case, they are like 35 times less energy dense compared to gasoline. And that is the reason why it's hard to decarbonize this space. I will leave a list of trivia that I found really interesting. You can check the blog post for this episode on missionshunya.com. But I will leave you with one interesting trivia. I'm sure that is something that I've thought in the past as well. Why not grow more trees? Well, trees absorb like about 4 tons over 40 years. So that is why he says that it's not the first choice when we look at decarbonizing, because there are other technologies that can do much better. But of course, planting more trees and having more forest is really good. But mathematically, 4 tons over 40 years isn't right at this point in time because the challenge is very big. So do check the blog post for this episode, and I will list the other few trivias that I found really interesting. And finally, considering the book came out in early 2021, Bill Gates obviously had to talk about COVID-19. Because, as I mentioned a few times earlier as well, COVID-19 and climate change have something in common. And Bill Gates rightly puts this message across towards the end of the book. That what COVID-19 has taught us is that we need international cooperation to overcome the pandemic. And likewise, if we have to get over climate change, have a positive climate action, then we need to have international cooperation. And we have to work together, because if we don't, we will fail together. So with that note, I think it's a good time to wrap up the podcast episode as well. I hope this episode, like the other episodes that I do from time to time, the solo ones, I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to share your feedback. If you liked it, do spread the word across to your friends, family, colleagues. It takes just about like 30 seconds to share the episode in your network. Of course, your reviews, ratings on podcast platforms definitely help because it spreads the message. It puts the podcast right on top of the charts, so please consider doing that. So with that, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off, and as always, thank you for listening.